Scroop. What is that?
So it's a form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. I like to say there's kind of a spectrum of anxiety issues that people can have. Obsessive-compulsive disorder, where you're like extremely worried about very specific things, or you're obsessed about them.
I think it's really important for us to bring this more to the forefront for people to understand and learn more about and become more just informed.
Is research being done now because like scientists have identified a set of genes that are very strongly associated with OCD. People who have scrupulosity think that they don't have enough faith, but they want to be faithful. Their religious beliefs are important to them. They don't want to leave the church.
The context of the LDS Church. What are some of the common obsessions or compulsions related to the Scroop experience?
And I think the biggest thing is just a general concern that they're not worthy.
So he pulled me in his office and he grilled me for like an hour and about, am I in a gang? Am I doing this? Da, 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 da. Like, at that point, I lived like I had to do everything right in the church because that was the perception that I was exuding. So it like towards my mission, towards everything. Like I had to be perfect. Yes, we can all be like Nephi, but heck, we can be like Sam too. He just followed the prophet and got the same blessings as he did.
It's okay to be like Nephi's nephew's second cousin. Right side, but I am trying my hardest.
This is our first episode of our series about mental health. We have some great conversations that are going to be coming to you today. We have Claire Breedlove here. We also have the brothers. We got Will, we got Mo, Isaiah, Crispin, Raymond. And we're missing Chris. Chris will hopefully be on for the next one. We'd like to thank Serve Clothing for the support of this episode. Their commitment to quality and their shirts are next to none. Please use our code FOYERFAM for a special offer in the description. We also want to start with just introducing Claire Breedlove. She is a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in providing evidence-based treatment for religious OCD, also known as Scrupulosity, and the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Claire is an active member of the International OCD Foundation. Claire currently serves on the board of directors of the Mormon Mental Health Association and is licensed to practice in California, Utah, Arizona, Idaho, Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. Claire holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University and the Tulane University School of Social Work. More information about her practice is available at www.mountainhomeocd.com. Well, Claire, thank you so much for being here. I guess the first thing I want to ask you is, how did you find us? How did we get connected?
So I have to say it was a friend of my ward who was much younger and hipper and cooler than I am. We were talking about like church podcasts, like cool things to listen to. And she mentioned that her husband is like a great connoisseur of like hip, cool church podcasts. And he recommended your show. And I listened to it and thought it was pretty awesome. So
Sweet. Okay, we're hip, we're cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's awesome. I mean, it's been kind of fun just these last few months. We're starting to ramp up, and a lot of people have been hitting us up and saying they've enjoyed the show and that we're covering a lot of various topics. And I feel like people are going to really enjoy this topic today, talking about mental health and things that everyone is suffering in silence about, you know. And so I think it's really important for us to bring this more to the forefront for people to understand and learn more about and become more just informed, you know. And so we really appreciate you for coming on and reaching out to us so that we can have you on and learn more about scrupulosity. So speaking of scrupulosity, scrupulosity. See, I can't even say it. It's a foreign word.
It's the worst word. It's the worst.
I want to call it just scruple or something. Isn't that a game?
We actually, in kind of like clinical circles amongst people who treat OCD, we just call it scroop, which is maybe even worse.
Okay.
From now on, for the rest of this episode, we're saying scroop. All right, I'm not excited.
So let it be done.
So,
I like it.
Scroop, what is that? Claire, can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so it's a form of obsessive compulsive disorder. So OCD it's an anxiety disorder. So I like to say there's kind of a spectrum of anxiety issues that people can have. So kind of on one end, there's like generalized anxiety disorder, where it's like kind of worry warts disease, where you're just like worried about everything. Right. And then on the other end of the spectrum is obsessive compulsive disorder, where you're like extremely worried about very specific things, or you're obsessed about them. And so there are lots of different, what we call themes in OCD. So kind of the classic one that most people are aware of is like, people who are worried about like germs and contamination. So they're washing their hands like 85 times a day. Right. But there's actually an OCD theme or kind of subtype that focuses on religious or moral themes. So people who are really worried that they're not worthy enough, that they've angered God somehow, that they've committed unpardonable sins that they can't repent for. Things like that. So that's kind of what my work focuses on.
Gotcha. Okay. So what made you want to specifically work within the LDS community instead of just keeping it broad? Why was this something for you?
Well, I'm a member of the church. I'm active. And when I started working with people with obsessive compulsive disorder, I just here and there would get calls from, a stake president I knew, or, some other, a church leader that, usually I had a personal connection to, wondering if I could, treat this kid who just came home from his mission and was having a lot of trouble, or, something like that. And the thing with people with scrupulosity is most of them are afraid to go to a non-member therapist because they're terrified that they're going to be told the treatment is like, well, you just need to leave the church. Mm-hmm. And so most Latter-day Saints with scrupulosity will only see a Latter-day Saint therapist. And as you can imagine, there are not that many of us who are well-trained in treating OCD, who also happen to be active members of the church. So, I say that I'm really lucky that my clients have kind of found me over time, because one of the best things about my work is I feel like, I'm kind of uniquely positioned to be able to work with some of these people, and that's a real blessing.
Wow. Okay. So that's
awesome.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I mean, so it happens a lot within the LDS community, I guess, but do you see like a specific age range, or is it kind of just it's the whole spectrum? You see it from teenagers all the way to 85 years old.
I mean, I think my youngest client right now is 10 and my oldest is 73. So it definitely can span all ages. There's a small group of people who will see, onset of symptoms in childhood. But most people will see symptoms begin in late teens and early 20s. So I work with a lot of youth and young adults. And, I think in our community, it's kind of particularly intense and interesting because, this is all happening right around the time when people may be either considering serving a mission or on a mission or have just returned. So, they're like particularly vulnerable to OCD if they have kind of the genes and that kind of thing. And they're also in a time of their life when they're having these like very intense, extended religious experiences.
Gotcha. I have a question, and you kind of answered it a little bit. I was going to ask you, seeing the wide range from 10 to 73, and if we're talking about Scroop specifically, just from your experience and the individuals that you have worked with, do you think that this is something that is not only developed, but could be like a genetics where people could be born with maybe a higher chance or risk of developing this disorder?
Yeah, so it's really that's a great question. Super interesting. There is research being done now because like scientists have identified a set of genes that are very strongly associated with OCD. And so we know that there is a strong genetic component to it. And just, anecdotally, like I've worked with plenty of families where I've treated, multiple members of the same family. But of particular interest to you all is, of course, the initial research was done using like white European samples. And so now there are actually some awesome researchers at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston who are looking to enroll people with OCD who are of African descent and who are Hispanic, so that they can like diversify the genetic pool that's being used in this research.
That's really,
yeah.
I'm trying to think if I got any family members who are OCD. You feel like
who can I refer?
Yeah. Any suspicious. Well, if anybody's listening, it's Baylor College of Medicine, or you can write to me and I'll connect you with the investigators on the study. Yeah, because they're looking for folks.
Awesome. So when we like within the church, it's broad right now. So let's bring it back more into within the church. Who are your clients mostly of? Do they consist more of return missionaries or missionaries? Are people about to go on their mission? Yeah. Or is it a lot of return missionaries? Or is it people who are in leadership within the church? Where do you feel like there's this larger amount of people?
Yeah. So, I mean, I see a kind of a chunk of people who are kids who are struggling in primary, things like that. But then, by far the biggest group of people I see in my practice are like young single adults. So, sometimes people will come to me right before, like they've just gotten their mission call. They have like 3 months and they know that something's not right and they need to get this sorted out. And so we're usually able to do a lot of good work and get them situated to go on to serve a successful mission. I see some people who go out into the mission field and start to really struggle, and then we got to bring them back home. And that's hard, but you get through it. And then I do see quite a lot of like returned missionaries who have come back and, they realize that their relationship with the church and with their spiritual life is not quite what they want it to be, and kind of need to unpack some experiences that they had on their mission and get some new tools and things like that so that they can have the kind of spiritual experiences that they want to have.
Right.
Yeah. In regards to the context of the LDS Church, what are some of the common obsessions or compulsions related to the Scrupulosity experience?
And I think the biggest thing is just a general concern that they're not worthy. So that they're not good enough, that they don't have enough faith, that they're not, doing the things that they need to do to, stay on the covenant path. More specifically, I'll often see people who, they are like constantly feeling like they've done something wrong, like they're looking for reassurance. Either they want to confess to their bishop all the time, or they have like a significant other or a parent who they're like calling up all the time, like wanting to know, like, are you sure this is okay? I did this wrong. Like, I'm not, and then we do, like, I see a lot of, sometimes things that we're taught to do that are meant to be faith promoting can turn into a compulsion. So, things like prayer, like, I've worked with clients who are, they're praying like 20 or 30 times an hour, and it's
wow.
Getting kind of disruptive to their lives.
Really?
Yeah. Like, and people I think can have a variety of kind of anxious experiences in the temple, that sometimes they need to work through. And, sometimes people have issues with garments. A lot of people who are in the church also have, most of the people I work with, and one of the reasons that I know this isn't a problem of faith, that it's an anxiety problem, is that, you know, most people also have like other OCD themes that they're dealing with. So by far the most common is something called like relationship OCD. So this is a lot of anxiety about like a primary romantic relationship. So like just absolutely paralyzed about like, is this the right person? Should I marry them? Like, am I sure my husband's going to stay in the church? Like those kinds of questions are really common.
Wow.
So just from hearing that, it seems like, is it a cultural thing that of a misunderstanding of like being taught in their families that create this dynamic that's going on with them? Or is it just like a misunderstanding of gospel principles? Or what do you feel like is the mix of what's making this manifest so much?
So, you know, OCD is like a very slippery illness, and it tends to like latch on to things that are like most important to people. So, you know, almost like without exception, the people I work with who have Scrup are very faithful people. Like their faith is extremely important to them.
Yeah.
And that's why the OCD is so distressing. And so, you know, I don't think there's anything that, yeah, I mean, we know from studies that like Latter-day Saints don't have higher rates of scrupulosity than people of any other religious background. So I think it's more a function of the OCD just kind of grabbing on to whatever it can than us having any particular teachings that are like causing OCD. That's certainly not the case. Yeah. I mean, I do think that there are like some of our language sometimes can, you know, kind of lends itself to being misunderstood by people with scrupulosity, but it's not that like being a Latter-day Saint makes you more likely to have OCD or anything like that.
Yeah.
It makes me think of...
See, that's interesting because that was one of the questions I had, because, I mean, I've never heard of this before, and it seems like, or after doing some research, it seems like there's, for me, being LDS, it feels like that, but there's not really a difference in like the levels of scrupulosity in the LDS church versus different faiths.
Right. And it's interesting. Like I do spend time with, you know, people of other faiths who treat religious OCD. And I think that we actually are a little bit more successful as a group sometimes than some of the other, you know, faiths I kind of hear about, because we are so centralized as a faith, and we are, you know, relatively homogenous in our beliefs. When you know, look at like evangelical Protestantism or something like that, you know, there are like tons of people who have, you know, all kinds of different things they're considering. It actually, you know, like I have colleagues who will spend like months and months trying to like clarify like matters of doctrine with their clients. And I don't really ever have that issue, because I think, you know, like I can point somebody to the handbook and say like, you don't need to confess to your bishop about this. Like, this isn't close to what the handbook says is a serious sin. And most of the time people are like, okay, yeah, sure, Claire, cool. So, yeah. I mean, I think there are definitely like some aspects of our culture that, you know, try to kind of prioritize perfectionism, but we also have a lot of tools to help people who are struggling with OCD.
Yeah, is that some of the are those some of the misconceptions that like you said, people are just like, that's nothing there. What are some of the misconceptions that you find that you have to try to debunk?
I mean, I think people sometimes want to blame the church for people's OCD experiences of OCD, and I mean it's just not like it's not the church's fault. Like it's people's genetics, it's their kind of age and station in life, it's a lot of complex environmental factors. Like it's not the church.
Gotcha, wow. There's a talk by, I don't know if it came out a few years ago. It was by Elder Holland. I think he said, "Be ye perfect eventually," or something like that.
Yeah.
And I feel like we were told to be perfect or become like Jesus Christ. I feel like a lot of us, even me, you know, we want to become worthy as what people say, or we want to live up to the standard. But I feel like sometimes we move the standard too much for ourselves where we can't even get to it. And it's like moving the goalpost, and to the point where, we get into this group and we feel like, what's the point?
Yeah.
Why am I keep trying if I'm going to just keep failing? And it just turns into this bad cycle, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, one thing I usually do with my clients is kind of invite them to reflect on the nature of Heavenly Father. Because if you're kind of in like Scroop mode, it's easy to think that like there's this like checklist of things that you have to get done. And if you don't get it done, something terrible is going to happen. If we think about like what we know about Heavenly Father, like, I don't think he would care about a checklist like that. Like, I think he's kind and he's loving and he knows us by name and communicates with us individually in a way that we understand. And so that doesn't square. So it's like, we've got to sort out what's coming from your anxiety and what's actually coming from the Spirit.
I want to second like what you just said, because as I'm listening, like I was thinking back on, I feel like I've kind of dealt with this like in a very subtle way early in my marriage. I remember, early in my marriage, my wife we kind of joke about it now, but she would say, yeah, like you used to run our family with an iron rod, like we had to pray, we had to read the scriptures at this time, we had to do this, and that. And she felt like I was like really strict. And like, for me, we were married in 2014. I was baptized in the church at 2010. I was 23 years old. Went on a mission at 2011. Came. So we were married. Like, so this was like a super just new, fresh experience for me. And like, so I felt the need to just like be like super committed. But it wasn't until like what you just said, I learned more about like Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ, and I learned more about grace, and like I learned more about their nature and their mercy. That's when I began to like ease off the brake, and like still did my best, but I wasn't like so hard on myself, so hard on my family. And so that helped a lot, like just learning more about like who they are and like how patient they are with us.
Yeah. Well, I think my clients probably find it obnoxious that I do like to remind them that, in the Book of Mormon, we're taught that, men are that they might have joy. Right. And that, it's not meant to be some like death march to the finish. Like,
Yeah. I like to tell people like, yes, we can all be like Nephi, but heck, we can be like Sam too. He just followed the prophet and got the same blessings as he did. You know what I mean? Like it's this should be a beautiful voyage. Like I remember when I was 12, I was 12 years old. The bishop's daughter liked me. That's crazy. The bishop was white. So he pulled me in his office and he grilled me for like an hour and about, am I in a gang? Am I doing this? Da, 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 da. Like, and I didn't even, it was unbeknownst to me, right? But from that point, I lived like I had to do everything right in the church because that was the perception that I was exuding. So it like towards my mission, towards everything, like I had to be perfect. And I remember one of my companions, like, wake up at 6, doing it everything like clockwork. I was the first missionary to learn all the scriptures that we needed to. Back when I went on a mission, I had to learn discussions. I was the first missionary in that came out to learn it within the 6 weeks. And then I was doing everything grit until my companion, who didn't do any of those things, and I would always look at him. I would always look down upon him. But then when he would teach, he would struggle reading the discussions. But then it was so sincere, it was so authentic. You could feel the Spirit, and that was something that I was like, because I was so focused on marking off a checklist, and because of that, I would focus on, okay, the checklist is there, which means I'm a good person, and I could da 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 da. So it wasn't until my mission where I was like free, where I was like, okay, I can be like Sam.
I'm more like Nephi's nephew's second cousin right side. But I am trying my hardest to be like Uncle Sam in that regard. But so we're kind of talking about this and learn a little bit more about it. But I'm curious. Have you noticed, I guess, more of these tendencies, more and more scrupulosity issues coming from a certain segment of the population, whether that's demographic, whether that's male, female, or anything like that, or is it kind of just spread around with a little healthy dose of everybody and everything in there?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I see more kind of people in their late teens and 20s, just because I think that's a function of, when most people are first starting to have symptoms, if they're going to have symptoms. But, one thing that, since I'll jump back a little bit, since we're talking about Nephi, one thing about OCD is that it's fundamentally an inability to tolerate uncertainty, right? So you are really worried about something, and like you can get reassurance from all these people in your life, from Heavenly Father, from the Spirit. And it's not enough, because you can't accept that, like life is uncertain. Like, who knows? Anything could happen. Like, but one of my favorite stories actually from the Book of Mormon is actually from the example of Nephi, that like sometimes we just have to like go forward not knowing, and just
absolutely
make the best decision we can with the information we have at the time, and that's a big part of OCD treatment.
I'm gonna highlight that one. I'm gonna circle that one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a good one.
So
that's a really good one. That's a really good one.
What are some things that we can do to support a family member or someone that we know that's struggling with scrupulosity?
Yeah.
There you go. You got it.
You got it.
Yeah, good job. You're hired. No, the biggest thing you can do for someone you love, if they have scrupulosity or another form of OCD, it's counterintuitive. So, like, say your sister is like really worried that she is not reading her scriptures enough and she's not worthy to enter the temple. And so she calls you up and she's like, hey, well, like, I'm so worried about this. This is a big problem. And like, you're a nice guy and you love your sister. So you want to be like, hey, like, you're one of the best people I know. It's great. Don't worry about it. Don't do that. Because if you do that, she's going to feel good for a little while, but then like, she's a smart person. So she's going to be like, well, Will probably wasn't even paying that good of attention. Like, he doesn't know what I did last week. Like, how does he know? And then the anxiety will like continue to cycle. So what you want to do sometimes is lean into the uncertainty. So like, yeah, like maybe you are worthy, maybe you aren't. Like, that's not for us to decide. Like, you'll just have to see. And so by doing that, it stops the cycle and sort of forces your anxious friend or relative to figure out ways of dealing with the fundamental problem, which is that inability to tolerate uncertainty.
Gotcha.
Yeah, love that.
Wow.
So you got to fight the urge to be reassuring.
Yeah.
It's definitely counterintuitive for sure.
It's very counterintuitive.
I would definitely be in that camp of, oh, you don't need to worry about it.
Yeah.
all good.
Yeah. It's interesting when I treat like little kids who are kind of too young to do a lot of the typical cognitive therapies that we do. We just work with the parents on stopping reassurance and like reducing accommodations that they're making for the anxiety, and most of the time it works great. So.
Oh wow!
Okay.
Yeah, so that was my question earlier. I was like, is it just a family cultural thing that they're creating this environment where these children are becoming that way? 'Cause that honestly breaks my heart, hearing children feel that way.
Yeah.
You know, and so what are these things that parents can do to help cultivate and fix, or not fix, but support and help these children that may be dealing with that?
Yeah, I think for these really young kids who have, significant OCD symptoms. I mean, it's just a kind of unfortunate, bad luck, bad genes. But there's, the good news is that the treatment is really effective, for most people. And so you really want to, work on trying to support like your kids developing the skills to be like psychologically flexible, helping them learn to tolerate uncertainty. Like we don't know what's going to happen. Maybe we'll have to learn and see. And then, making sure that you're not like changing your whole household to accommodate some like obsessive concern of your child and the reassurance stuff. But there are lots of really good resources for parents out there who may have like really anxious kids, because a lot of times the most effective thing you can do is really counterintuitive. So it's kind of hard for parents to like make that jump, because obviously like you love your kids, like you don't want to, do something that isn't loving or that doesn't feel loving. So there are a lot of good resources, but one that I really recommend is a program called SPACE, Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. And it goes through a lot of different skills that parents can use to help their kids better manage their anxiety.
This episode is probably one episode that I'm going to take notes on.
Yeah.
This is amazing.
Sorry, Raymond.
No, go ahead.
No, does it look different in a child versus an adult?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because the child's environment is different. So, and kids have a different, kind of ability to understand, some of the concepts about how anxiety works, how OCD works. So, it's interesting with kids, like baptism sometimes is like a big inflection point for them, that, they're thinking about like, sin and repentance and being clean and all that. And so sometimes that can be tricky for some kids. And then, I think there are just some kids who are really, they're a little bit rigid, and, they want to do things in like a very specific way every day. And, it's just harder for them to learn how to like roll with the punches and be a little bit more flexible.
So I have a question with that, especially since I'm now finding out that this is something that presents itself even in younger kids as well. But there's a common theme that I'm kind of hearing as we kind of put forth some of these scenarios is, I guess I'm trying to get into what are some of the contributing factors, because what it sounds like is a lot of times what happens is there's some kind of milestone trigger point that kind of sparks some of these feelings of, oh, am I going to be able to meet these new requirements that will be asked of me moving forward, like going on a mission, like getting married, like getting baptized? Is that our milestone or triggers like that usually what kind of sparks those things, or are these symptoms that might have been present all along, and then that milestone or that situation is what just kind of sparked it?
So I think it's somewhat unusual for people to be able to identify like one specific thing that like kind of blew the whole thing up. And it's more common that people will have some kind of like big experience, like, deciding to go on a mission or something like that. And it kind of brings things that have been like percolating for a while kind of up to the forefront. That happens a lot.
Okay. So
question from my side, we kind of talked about some like the space treatment, for like your average adult that you're working with. What kind of like, what's your approach to treatment? Like, what can people kind of expect if they were to work with you and get help?
Yeah,
what does that look like?
That's a good question. So the gold standard treatment for OCD is something called exposure and response prevention. So exposure therapy. So if I'll give you guys an example of something that's different than Scroop and then tell you how it relates. So if you come to me and you're like, hey, Claire, I'm so terrified of snakes and it's like really affecting my life, I would be like, okay, cool. And I'd start out, I'd show you a picture of a snake and you'd get real anxious because you're afraid of snakes. And then I'd have you just sit there and be anxious until you eventually come back down to baseline, because anxiety is always temporary, never dangerous, sometimes really uncomfortable, but not going to hurt you. So then when you get back to baseline, because I'm mean, I just immediately show you the picture of the snake again. And this time you're going to be anxious, but probably a little bit less anxious than you were the first time, because you've just had this experience of your brain learning that like you could be anxious and then it could be okay. And so then we continue on like that until you become like habituated to the picture of the snake. You just get used to it because you've seen it so many times. And so then we introduce something that's like slightly more anxiety provoking. So maybe I show you like a YouTube video with a bunch of snakes, and we do the same thing. We have you look at it over and over again until you're comfortable with it, until you're habituated to it. And then maybe next I send you to the zoo and you're like looking at the snakes through the glass. We do that for a while. And then, you know, finally you're like at the pet store holding the snakes or whatever. So, you know, the idea behind this treatment is that if we basically like force your brain to interact with the trigger enough times and have the experience of things turning out okay, or even if sometimes there is some kind of like thing that happens with exposures, but it's, you know, it's never as bad as you think it's going to be. And so then you face your fear and you overcome it. So we use the same principle when people are experiencing scrupulosity, except we use different tools to expose them in different ways to the ideas. So we do this in lots of different ways, but I'll give you guys an example that lots of people think is funny. I often use, so for people who are really concerned about worthiness, we'll use the Temple Recommend questions as exposures. So they're reading through the Temple Recommend questions like over and over again. And I thought it was so funny. I had to have my Temple Recommend renewed a few months ago, and I realized that I have the questions completely memorized because I've had so many clients use them as exposures. Yeah, but it's funny, you know, invariably, like every time I do this, I get, you know, there's one question when they're like, yes, that's it. That's the problem. And
I have a question in regards to mental health and mental illness. What kind of message would you give to where we bring this to the forefront to talk about it, where it's not something that's so taboo or it's somebody else?
Yeah. You know, I think, you know, the more people who are open and talking about it, you know, that's really important. You know, there have definitely been some talks and general conference recently that have highlighted mental health issues. And, you know, Sister Alberto, who was in the Relief Society General Presidency, speaks openly about her father's death by suicide. And, you know, things like that are really important. But I also, you know, I like to have conversations with my clients about how, you know, their OCD like can actually kind of be their superpower. That because they've had to like walk this journey with scrupulosity, they have the experience of looking at their faith in so many different ways and through so many different lenses that people who have never struggled with that never do. And so it's like, of course, it's hard and it's painful, and maybe you wouldn't have chosen it if you had the option. But I think there is like a richness and a complexity and kind of a new appreciation for the gospel that can come with, you know, doing the treatment.
Love that.
So Claire, would you say that maybe diagnosing oneself or a family member or friend, would you say it's relatively easy to kind of spot some of the signs of it showing of some level of OCD, like maybe not scrupulosity in of itself, because that seems to be more nuanced, but like just let's just say, you know, because it stems from OCD, it's a form of OCD. So are some of those symptoms or some of those characteristics easy to spot to where it's like, oh, I think I actually might have a disorder, as opposed to just maybe I'm just a little obsessive about X, Y, or Z?
Yeah. So, I mean, diagnosis can be complex, but what I think is really helpful to focus on is like functioning. So, you could be somebody who's like very obsessive and has like an extremely rigid schedule and all that kind of stuff. But if you're fine and you're like functioning and thriving in life, then like we're not going to treat it. But if you are really unhappy, you're struggling in work or school or, some kind of other key area of your life, you're struggling in your relationships, you're parenting, something like that. Like if it's impacting your ability to function, then you want to talk to somebody. Interestingly, in kind of the standard OCD assessment, the Yale Brown obsessive compulsive scale, it actually asks you like, how many hours a day are you spending on your obsessions and compulsions? So I think, it's a little bit of a weird way to phrase the question, but I think it's also helpful sometimes that like, if you're, you realize, you kind of reflect and realize that like your time is being consumed with worries and like with things that you're doing to try to manage those worries that aren't helping, then you probably want to talk to somebody.
Okay.
Do you think it's normal to have something that you're a little bit obsessed with? Or is there like, hey, this is the threshold where this is bad? You said, I think you maybe might have mentioned that where you can't function.
Yeah.
But I feel like I've known people, maybe I'm just projecting, but I feel like when there's some things that you really want to get done or you really want to accomplish or you don't want to do again or repeat or become like or whatever, you kind of do anything and everything possible to prevent that from happening. It almost becomes not your personality, but you're very hyper aware of that, like signals or signs that represent that thing that you don't want to become or that person that you don't want to be like. Is that somewhat of a form of OCD, or is that kind of in a normal way of just, hey, you're just very self-aware and you're trying to
potentially it kind of would depend on like what is specifically happening, and also just like are you cool with this, or is it really upsetting you, and like is this like distracting from your ability to like do the things that you need to do in your life, to to work, to go to school, to have relationships, to like take care of your basic needs, those kinds of things.
Gotcha.
Okay, so I want to take a second and throw a little bit of a curveball. So I want to what I want to find out now is like how does the process of being treated I guess happen. So I'll throw myself out on the fire. I am a performing artist. I record music. I do all things like that, right? And awesome. I'm new to it. I spent my whole life being obsessively compulsive about basketball, and kind of like Andrew was saying, and this is why I wanted to bring it up, is because in the realm of professional sports, you have athletes who are just like that. They're hyper focused. They're obsessive about it because they're either trying to make a certain goal and play in a certain league, or they're trying not to lose their chance or spot in that league to someone else. So there's an obsession around it to where I gotta be my perfect self, or I'm gonna miss out, or I'm gonna lose money, or I'm gonna lose a chance, right? So I come from that realm of just needing to focus on being as perfect as I can be to shine in my best self. So not like I need to be like someone else, but just focusing on myself and trying to make everything about me, the perfect version of me, so that I can have the most opportunities that I can have, right? So I get done with coaching basketball, I get done with playing basketball, and now I'm stepping into this world of performing. And part of that is having to get yourself out there with social media and something like that, right? So this is something I struggle with because I don't want to put a video out of me singing unless, in my opinion, it's absolutely flawless. So I get a little paralysis. I've got all these videos in my phone that I thought I would post, and then I look at them and I'm like, no, that's not good enough. I got to do it again. So I struggle with that. And the brothers know, they're starting to smile a little bit because they're like, bro, when are you going to put a video out? I'm like,
he can sing. He can sing amazing.
I'm sorry.
I'm
Everyone
sure
who's listening, this man can sing. Not sing, sang.
But it's kind of like how you're saying with people who deal with scrupulosity. It's like, if I'm gonna fail, why try? I'm not saying that's the extreme I'm on, but I can parallel it a little bit to my life. So here I am. I get referred to you, Claire. I'm walking in. I'm struggling, man. Like, I think I'm going to be perfect, or I might leave this alone. Like, how does that initial conversation with you go? What are we doing at first?
I mean, so sometimes we talk about the clinical name for it is a cognitive distortion. So it's basically a messed up way of thinking. And, people with OCD tend to struggle with like the same set of cognitive distortions. So, things like all or nothing thinking. So like, if the video isn't perfect, I can't, it's trash. I can't do anything with it. Or, perfectionism, certainly, like it has to be absolutely perfect. Other things that like might be going on with your situation is like, sometimes there's this like fortune telling thing that we do, like, oh, I know if it's not exactly right, like nobody will like it and I'll be like mocked and, ruined forever. So sometimes it's helpful just to like realize like, okay, wait, like what's even happening here? Like, what am I even thinking? And just like processing those thoughts can sometimes be really helpful for people because, there are like big, distortions that I think can really be problematic.
Okay.
But, there's also this thing that happens in OCD that people with OCD tend to think that like, just because they have like a thought about something, that thought is meaningful. And so one of the things about, I don't have OCD, but one of the things about OCD treatment that I think has kind of changed my outlook just on life is this idea that like, yeah, just because I have a thought that like something's bad, or, I have a thought that's intrusive, that's like not something that I want to be thinking about necessarily. Like it doesn't have to mean anything. Like it can just be a thought. And, human beings have like 50,000 thoughts a day. And when you're anxious or when you have OCD, like certain thoughts get really sticky and kind of hard to get rid of. And so you start to think that they're important. And like, it doesn't actually have to be that way. So sometimes, working on just like, okay, yeah, like I'm having this doubt. Like, I know that like, it's probably not reality based. Like it can just be there. I can just have this thought and recognize it in a non-judgmental way and then go about my day.
Oh, that's amazing.
I like that.
That is, yeah.
That's awesome. So was my situation, Claire, was that Scroop, or was it just a trauma based from I'm just kidding.
Like a cautionary tale about the need for diversity and inclusion in the church.
Hey, that's real. That's
terrible.
Real. So, Claire, there was something you mentioned about like how you may have these thoughts, and we don't have to run with it and make it more than what it is. Is that kind of in that same realm with? So I've heard that scrupulosity, especially within the church community, people kind of blur the lines with faith crisis.
Yeah.
And is that in that same realm? How do we differentiate between having a faith crisis and scrupulosity?
That's a really good question. People who have scrupulosity think that they don't have enough faith, but they want to be faithful. Their religious beliefs are important to them. They don't want to leave the church. So in OCD, the intrusive thoughts that you have are always ego dystonic, which means that it is contrary to what you want. So for people with scrupulosity, they're having thoughts that are blasphemous or negative, or that whatever. That's not who they are. That's totally contrary to who they are. People who are having a faith crisis have a totally different situation. They're having a values-based issue with the church. So they've learned something in church history, or they have an issue with doctrine, and their concerns with the church aren't being driven by anxiety, which is what's happening for the people with scrupulosity. Their concerns are different. They're a values-based concern.
Gotcha.
But sometimes what happens is people who have scrupulosity get told, or they think, well, my symptoms will just go away if I leave the church. And then what unfortunately happens is they're unhappy that they've left the church, because that's not what they wanted to do in the first place. And, they still have this uncontrolled anxiety disorder that is probably negatively affecting them in other areas of their life. So I always tell people, like, okay, let's treat the OCD, let's treat the screw, and then, do whatever you need to do, like make whatever decisions you want to make, but make sure it's coming, not from a place of anxiety.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Oh, that's the idea, like the difference with the anxiety induced and then value induced, where you come with a truth that you may have confrontation with. That's something else, as opposed to something that's induced, like you said earlier, with anxiety, compulsion of those things. Wow. I love it.
That's a really good explanation. I'm just thinking of things I've heard from other people regarding like mental this. It seems like maybe it's always been around, but I feel like mental illness has become more prevalent, or maybe not just prevalent, maybe it's just more talked about now, and not given so much taboo. But I've heard from many people that if you have a mental illness or you're struggling with anxiety, it's because you are obviously not doing something right or whatever, and that kind of creates that anxiety issue, and that this whole thing that we're dealing with, or that it's some evil spirit or whatever it may be, or something like that. Yeah. Have you heard that, and what are your responses to when people say things like that?
I mean, there's nothing you can like do or not do to get OCD. It's mostly genetic, and with some environmental stuff thrown in there. But I think there's certainly more awareness about mental illness now. And I definitely see a difference with my like Gen Z clients that, they're much more comfortable, and, like there's an OCD club at BYU, like they do all kinds of stuff.
Oh, wow.
So it's, I think it's a little bit more like in the zeitgeist for people who are, maybe under 30. But I mean, I want people to like come away from this, and if think that they're having, OCD, scrupulosity, like some kind of related anxiety problem, like it's really treatable. Like I want people to be hopeful. In recent studies, for people who have like moderate OCD, if they get the gold standard of treatment, which is usually a high dose of an SSRI antidepressant, so something like Zoloft, Prozac, Lexapro, combined with exposure and response prevention, exposure therapy, like 70 or 80% of them get better.
Wow.
And
wow.
It's really, really high. And I think, I don't have evidence, just like I haven't done a study, but just anecdotally, I think the rates are even higher for people in the church, because they usually have really good support, really good access to resources. Like they got a whole team cheering them on. That doesn't always happen in other situations. So like, OCD is bad. Like it's painful, it's difficult, but like there's so much hope. It's so treatable. And, I feel really fortunate that, I get to work with people who, they get better, they go on their missions, they get married, they live their lives. Like it's good.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
This is kind of a side note thought, but I feel like mental health is more prevalent. I know, Andrew, you mentioned that, not prevalent, but more aware. And my personal feeling is just because of, the impact social media has on today's society. People are so, especially like influencers, and even not even influencers, but just other individuals are so aware of like other people's perception of them on the internet, which can actually, on the backside, affect and kind of raise those mental issues, you know, that some people go through. But my question is like, why, like, just from what you know and from individuals that you've treated, like, why is mental illness like considered like a silent killer? Why is it like people don't feel the need? Is there like a clinical reason why people don't reach out for help sooner, or and they wait till things get really bad to actually seek help?
I mean, I think it's a combination of stigma and of access to care. You know, unfortunately, you know, for people with OCD, there's a huge shortage of qualified professionals who are well trained in exposure, who can treat them. You know, the average age, the International OCD Foundation says that like the average age from onset of symptoms to like diagnosis and treatment for most people is like 9 years. So, you know, it's a long time.
Man.
But it's tough. But I like to, you know, kind of give people the analogy that like if you had high cholesterol, like your doctor would probably tell you to take some medication and make some lifestyle changes. And it's the same thing with OCD and with a lot of other mental illnesses. Like we may want you to take some medication for a while, maybe for longer, who knows? But like there's no like moral value associated with like taking psychotropic medications. And, you know, we're probably going to want you to, you know, do some therapy to make some changes in how you're thinking about things and how you're doing some things in your life. And so I think when people are able to kind of like make that mental shift and stop looking at it as like something I did wrong, or, you know, and it's just another health condition, just like any, you know, just like high cholesterol, just like diabetes, like, you know, same thing.
Gotcha. Okay.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. This has definitely been a great episode, being able to learn more about Scroop and how it affects us and how we can help our friends and family. Speaking of that, do you have any resources that you can share with us that we can share with our friends and family and those who are listening?
Yeah, so I would point everybody to the International Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder Foundation website, which is www.iocdf.net. And it has a lot of resources about obsessive-compulsive disorder in general, about Scroop. It has a provider resource directory. That's a great place to start if you're looking for treatment yourself. And for parents, I would also recommend checking out the SPACE treatment website, Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions.
Awesome. Perfect. We'll make sure to put those in the caption or in the description below, so keep an eye out for that. Yeah, it's been awesome being able to speak with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys. It's been such a pleasure to be here, and you're doing amazing work. So I'm so honored to be here.
We appreciate it. And those who are listening, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Something on here that spoke to you, make sure to share with your friends or your family. And if you had a question about what was said, please leave a comment below. We love to hear them. We definitely like to reply to our viewers. And we'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks so much. Peace.